One night, on the 10th of November 1483, in the town of Eisleben in Germany, a baby boy was born. He was given the name Martin, and he was the firstborn of his parents Hans and Margaret Luther. Today we are going to explore the story of Martin Luther's life, his choices, and the world which was shaped by them. But in order to understand his story and his impact on Christianity, we must have a look at the world he was born into and the history which shaped it. Let's have a peek into the world of Martin Luther. Luther was born about 1500 years after Jesus' time on earth. Following Jesus' ascension, there existed communities of churches, believers that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the Son of God. And these communities spread out from Judea into the territories of the greater Roman Empire. This is happening in the 1st century AD, and relatively speaking, Christians made up a small group. Many of them struggle for years under persecution by Rome for their faith. But in the 300s, Rome gets a new emperor. His name is Constantine, and Emperor Constantine comes to believe in Jesus as being God and Savior of the world. In a striking surprise of all people, becomes himself a Christian. And in 313 AD, Constantine makes his convictions public news as he declares his beliefs and shares them with his subjects. 10 years later, Christianity went from being the recipient of mass persecution by Rome to being the official religion of the Roman Empire. But things would soon be changing politically in the world. The Roman Empire begins crumbling, and by the year 500, the empire has fallen. The supreme power which has so overwhelmingly been dictating and ruling much of the world for centuries is now suddenly gone. And this leaves Europe with a power vacuum. There is a long period of chaos, poverty, and complete social stagnation. This lasts for 10 centuries and is called the Middle Ages, or sometimes the Dark Ages or the medieval period. But it is here that the organized religion of Christianity in Europe steps in, because even though the political and military power of Rome crumbled, the state-sanctioned religion and church didn't. In fact, during this chaotic time, it is the church which holds Europe together and unified. It provided religion, stability, and it was the one thing that politically united a fractured Europe, offering continuity and comfort in a troubling age. Fragments of the old Rome lived on in the church, so Roman senators became bishops, and the Roman emperor became known as the Christian Pope. The word Pope comes from the Latin papa, which means father, so the emperor becomes known as the father of the church. And because of this, Rome becomes considered the political Christian epicenter because the Pope ruled from there. The church becomes known as Catholic, again a word from the Roman Latin simply meaning universal. So the universal, the one church. Because of this power shift and the fall of the Roman Empire, although the organized religion of Christianity begins as a small group of believers in the 1st century, by the 3rd century, the church had become an institution powerful enough to rival state governments. Because of this historical blend between religion and state, by the Middle Ages, the church had its own army and massive resources at its disposal. The Pope became more powerful than many members of the royalty in Europe, and he had greater political and military power than some emperors and kings, and he had more money. And with all this power and money came what usually comes: corruption. First of all, during the Middle Ages, the Church embraced what is, in essence, institutionalized slavery, a system called feudalism. Feudalism was a hierarchy where noblemen and rulers sit on top. They control the wealth, land, and power in the country, while the majority of people do the hard labor and work. So that is an overview of the developments after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, let's have a closer look at what life looked like in Europe, and specifically in Germany at the time that Martin Luther was born. What was life like? Well, most people were born in tiny villages or towns. Most of them were poor and illiterate. Most children died before adulthood due to malnutrition and disease. Many were farmers who worked to survive, and as we said, the nobility controlled the wealth, land, and power, while the peasants did all the hard labor. Most people didn't move or travel. They would live and die in around the same area they were born in. The biggest structure you as a peasant could see from your town would be your local church. Because not only did the nobility control the land and wealth, but they controlled the church as well. And in contrast to the backdrop of everyday lives of people, these would be great, expensive, beautiful structures. At this time, due to the church's Roman history, translated Bibles only existed in Latin. And Latin was only known by the nobility and church officials, those who could afford to attend university. So imagine if you were a German or French or English peasant. You'd never get to read a book, let alone the Bible. And there was little to no education for most people. If you were lucky, your local church or cathedral would have one Bible, and it would of course be in Latin and would likely, literally, be chained up, kept on a chain not to be removed from the building. Keep in mind this was during a time when books were rare, and they were all handwritten and hand-copied, so they were also very expensive. At the time, church libraries actually held most of the books existing in Western Europe. But, like the Bible on a chain, they were locked away, and church leaders were the gatekeepers to any knowledge they might contain. Additionally, for over 1,000 years, Mass was only said in Latin. So you could go to church, but whatever you heard was subject to the interpretation of your priest. You would go to church to receive the communion bread, but would have no idea what was being said. And all you could do is sit in the pew and nod in agreement to whatever the priest is saying from the pulpit. The Roman-led church continued to see a growing corruption and power hunger within its ranks. In Rome and other places alike, popes, bishops, and cardinals lived in luxury. And here's how they managed to amass and hang on to that power. Number one was, as we've said, because of the Roman Church's military power. So the Pope could threaten anyone he liked. If he wanted land, if a French king didn't do as the Pope commanded, he would mobilize his great army and eradicate anyone who dared disagree. Number two, we've described how dark and hopeless most peasants' lives were. So if your life is miserable, marred with poverty, death, ignorance, loss, and starvation, what becomes then your only hope? Heaven, the afterlife. Your life here would only be made tolerable as preparation for heaven. An escape to that other place would become everything to you, because it's the only escape you have. It's your only hope. And here is where we might glimpse one of the main sources of the powerful hold the Church in Rome had over believers. It lies in that, during those years, the Church was teaching all citizens that the Pope, the ruler and father of the Church, was the gatekeeper to heaven. This teaching was based on a misreading of Matthew 16, specifically verses 18 to 19. Based on this misreading, it was believed or argued that the Pope was the keeper of the keys to heaven and hell. He was presented as serving as a bridge between people and God. He had 100% authority as to who was saved or not, and who got to go to heaven or not. Number 3, the Church taught that there is no salvation outside the Church. Remember, it was called the Catholic Church, meaning the universal Church, implying there is only one. And if you fall outside that one church, you by de facto was said to lose any chance of salvation or going to heaven. Now put that idea together with the previous one. If heaven is your only way out, your only hope as a peasant, then obeying the Church and the Pope becomes equal to salvation. So with this theology and with his military power, the Pope in Rome could generally manipulate and force anyone to do what he wanted them to in much of Western Europe. And the threat was that if you disagree or dissent, you'll be wiped out by his army and lose your place in heaven and favor with God. The Pope used world events to also further scare people into obedience. For example, there was the rampant Black Death, the plague ravaging Europe at the time. It killed 1/3 of the population of the continent. The Church claimed this was the wrath of God and encouraged more fear-driven loyalty as a result. The popes also used public punishment and executions to demonstrate what happens when someone disobeys the Church. So public floggings, burning at the stake, such things ever stood as a threat over the general populace. Number 5, the collection of money. Now we've said that the Pope and bishops lived in luxury. How did they manage to get their hands on so much wealth? Well, firstly, church tithes were treated as a tax. Because the Pope was a political ruler as well as a spiritual one, he taxed all of Europe to fund his various vanity projects, his wars, the structures he had built, the art he commissioned, and so on. And these taxations were sometimes ruthless on the peasantry, who were already struggling to survive, particularly under feudal lords and noblemen. Why, you might ask, would the people allow themselves to be taxed in this way? Well, the root of this answer lies in how salvation was taught to them, how they were told that God's salvation works. In short, it looked a bit like a point system. You get plus points for doing good things and minus points for bad things. The more plus points you had, the more likely it was that heaven would be where you'd go when you died. And if you had an overwhelming amount of minus points, you'd go to hell. As we go through this story, we're going to go into more detail about what earned your soul heaven points, if we can call it that. Some of these things are called relics or indulgences, but we're going to come back to what those are. In short, earning good points often came down to money and donations. For example, the church might say, "We want to build this new cathedral. We need funding, so we'll tell people that they can earn plus points, heaven points, by donating." Well, in reality, we'll just forcibly tax them anyway. The church buildings which stood on the hill overlooking your town would represent generations of your family's savings. Your grandparents paid for it, your parents paid for it, you're paying for it. And each week, tired peasants would walk into these churches that had the most beautiful artwork and stained glass windows, and watching amazed, the walls would be covered in artwork which depicted how God's judgment was coming. Dramatic artwork depicting how he would reward only the faithful and punish those in hell who were deemed unfaithful. And of course, at the front of the church was always a money box, where you could put in your few last coins to try to escape the hell to come. The second way which the church managed to maintain such a strong grip on people's pockets was the theology of purgatory. Now, medieval Christians believed that you'd only go to heaven if you'd done more good than evil. And they were taught that most people would fall short, so when they died, God would need to purge them of their excess sin before they would be allowed to get into heaven. The church called this purging process purgatory, and it was described as years of misery and torment as God tortured you in a hellish place. Your time spent in purgatory would be determined by how much bad things you had done or how many bad points you had. People were taught that you could lower the amount of years in purgatory by being devout and doing things which earned you good points. Church officials took advantage of people's fear of purgatory. Monks would come to a dying man's bed, and before saying the blessing which was thought to send him off in peace to heaven, they would hold out their hand to be paid. So because donation or payment was attached to salvation, as we've said, the church had nearly unlimited power over income. We now have a bit of an understanding of the kind of world Luther was born into, and with that, let's carry on in the story and see what happens to this particular child as he grows up. As we said, Martin was the eldest son of Hans and Margaret Luther, and Martin's father was a copper miner, which meant that he was actually a rank above most of the other peasantry. Martin, as the family's firstborn, was expected to safeguard their middle-class status and was thus sent to study law. In those days, as in now, a legal career was seen as a secure and prestigious choice. Well, Luther complied with his father's wishes, and as a young 18-year-old, he moved to the town of Erfurt to study law. But during his days at university, Luther's mind was restless. As he began his legal studies, sitting in lectures and reading books, he was often troubled by bigger questions. He would spend nights worrying about heaven and hell. He wondered what was the point of examining the laws of the world when it was more important to think about the future of his soul and of heaven. Luther kept a journal during those days, and he wrote that he constantly worried about not being good enough in the eyes of God. He carried around such a crushing guilt for his own sins, and the fear of what punishment lay ahead weighed down on him. To Luther, God seemed to be demanding, hard, judgmental, and he couldn't understand how God could be good or how he, Luther, could ever be good enough. He wrestled and wrestled and wrestled with these things, and in the back of his mind, he wondered whether he ought not be working for the church instead of becoming a lawyer. In 1505, Luther was traveling from one village to another across an open field near Erfurt. The clouds were dark, and a storm had been brewing all day, but Luther's mind was elsewhere, and he didn't notice until he was caught in the middle of a crazy lightning storm. It hit just as he was in the middle of an open field. Without shelter and in serious danger, he threw himself to the ground as lightning struck the field all around him. As he lay on the ground, all Luther could think about was what would happen if he now died. Was he ready for the judgment? He didn't want to go to hell, and he was afraid of what would happen. Luther began praying for his life to be spared, and he swore loudly that he would become a monk if only he survived. Well, the storm did eventually stop. Luther did survive, and to the shock of his parents and friends, he announced he was giving up his career as a lawyer before he'd even completed his first semester of law. Luther, without hesitation, sold his law books, gave away his possessions, said his goodbyes, and 2 weeks later he joined the St. Augustine monastery to become a monk. Now, Luther did everything he could to be a good monk, and he applied himself with great dedication to his new surroundings, his new teachings, and the demands of his new lifestyle, because to him, his salvation rested on his devotedness. And the Augustinian order certainly demanded a lot of its monks. There, the daily devotions were designed to engineer a path to salvation. Their days were on a rigorous schedule. They'd be up at 4 a.m., they would kneel on cold stone floors for hours, praying in the chapel. They would punish themselves for sinful thoughts, and often used self-flagellation as a way to discipline and drive out the sin, so to speak. Luther would spend his whole day praying, doing acts of self-punishment. He'd spend hours literally lying on his face in front of the altar in the church, spending hours in the confessional, confessing every sin he could think of, scrubbing the floors till his hands were raw. Luther followed the prescribed routine, but he could never shake the agonizing doubts about his own salvation. Every night he wrestled in his room, because despite all he'd done to be a good Christian, he still felt the guilt. He still carried the burden, and he still had no peace when it came to who God was or where he stood with him. During this time at the monastery, Luther was given a spiritual mentor whose name was Johann von Staupitz. Staupitz served as a supervisor and vicar at the monastery, and he encouraged Luther to keep seeking and asking questions. On May the 2nd, 1507, the day had come for Luther to lead out his first public mass. In those days, this consisted of the priest saying the communion text in Latin, giving out the bread for people to eat, and in those days people were not allowed to partake in the wine of the communion, so it was only the priest who would drink the communion wine. Luther was very nervous on this day because he took this very seriously. The church at the time believed that when the priest spoke those words in Latin, when Jesus said, "This is my body and my blood," that the bread and wine literally turned into Jesus' flesh and blood. He was so afraid of saying something wrong and overwhelmed by the hugeness of being near Jesus' real body. And then, to add to the pressure, just before he went to do the Mass, one of Luther's assistants alerted him to the fact that his father had come to attend and was sitting in the pews. Luther stumbled through his first public Mass. Afterwards, he hoped his father would see the merit of his work and encourage him, but instead, as they stood outside the church, Luther's father chose this occasion to tell him of his disappointment with him, and said he was being disobedient, thus breaking the fourth commandment to honor your father and mother. And with that word of manipulation, he turned and went. Luther was again left standing with a mountain of guilt. worrying that his father was right and that he indeed was sinning. Despite being on track to an excellent career, Luther didn't feel peace with God. He continued to be tormented by feelings of unworthiness. He couldn't seem to marry this idea of a cruel God with any hope that things would be okay. His mentor, Staupitz, seeing Luther was deeply struggling, encouraged him to take on a more academic path. Staupitz hoped it would be a good distraction for Luther to study theology and perhaps help him work through some of his struggles. And so Luther enrolled in the theological program to earn his bachelor's and master's in theology. This, too, he worked hard at. In fact, he was soon considered knowledgeable enough to become a temporary lecturer at the university. Luther was ordained in 1507. During his years at the monastery and studying theology at the university, Luther became more and more aware of some of the common inside practices of the Church, and they increasingly bothered him. He looked at how the general populace was struggling with poverty, while Rome kept demanding donations and tithes to build great cathedrals and churches, meanwhile threatening people with hell if they didn't comply. He began also to notice the corruption of many local church officials, the desperation of believers, and the officials taking advantage of that desperation. With these things bothering him, Luther often spoke about them to his mentor. Now Staupitz agreed there was corruption in the church, and in response encouraged Luther to go on a pilgrimage to clear his head and be reinvigorated in his faith and focus. At the time, there were various pilgrimages which a believer could take, but the greatest pilgrimage of all was the one to Rome. From all over Europe and beyond, each year people would walk on foot, praying or chastising themselves all the way from their hometown to Rome, the center of Christendom. And it was this pilgrimage that Luther was sent on. In 1510, Luther walks to Rome, a distance of around 1,000 miles. And as he finally arrives and enters the city, he would have seen some of the sights which we can see today. He passed the Colosseum, the Pantheon. He walked through streets flooded with people from all over Europe. And looking around, Luther takes note of a few things. First, he noticed the roads were lined with booths, where salesmen were selling wooden crosses and prayers written on scrolls, prayer beads, vials claiming to contain holy water, and figurines of the saints, all claiming to bring a person closer to God and salvation. And then, on the other hand, Luther watched in horror as he saw some of his fellow monks and priests going in to see the prostitutes in the whorehouses and brothels of the city. He carries on, winding through cobblestone roads, because he was making his way to the crescendo, the goal, the final destination for all Christian pilgrims coming to Rome. This destination was St. Peter's Basilica, which still stands there today in the Vatican. St. Peter's was traditionally thought to have been built over the grave of Peter, the disciple of Jesus, and close to where Peter had been crucified. It was, in a way, the Pope's own church, his home church. It was certainly a majestic structure to behold, and was considered very holy. As Luther arrived at St. Peter's, he saw in front of him a sea of people. Thousands of pilgrims were climbing the steps to the church on their knees. The belief behind this act was that if you said a Hail Mary prayer on each step, while crawling up the steps on your hands and knees, you could reduce your time in purgatory by 1 year per step. Luther, of course, eager to find relief for his own burden, began in earnest to say his own prayers, climbing up the stairs with everyone else. This was his chance to perhaps make penance for some of his sins and find some peace. But the things which he'd seen along the way were nagging at him. The whole scene seemed crooked. He paused in his prayers, stood up and looked around him at all those kneeling people. They were wounded, the sick, the old, hungry for mercy, and he was struck by the enormous wealth of the church behind him and suffering of the people so desperately trying to come to God. And suddenly he felt a real disgust at what was beginning to look more and more like a cruel circus to him, preying on the vulnerable. Luther never did finish his Hail Marys and went inside instead. Now, the building of St. Peter's itself wasn't just in a special location, because as you went inside, the place was filled with what is called relics. Relics is a word which referred to the physical remains of something holy. So this could be a piece of the cross, the bone of the arm of Peter, milk from Mary's breast, the skull of Joseph, the hem of the garment of John. And people could see these relics and even touch them, kiss them, or pray over them, and this would add to your point system. So you could earn points for heaven or shave off years in purgatory. Inside St. Peter's, Luther found himself passing through what was like a museum of relics, skulls sitting on velvet cushions, bones kept in gold-encrusted boxes, and in front of each of these relics was, as always, a money box, and a guard who made sure that pilgrims paid before they paid homage to the relics. As Luther passed by relic after relic, he wondered if any of them were really real, because out on the street stood a man who claimed he was selling a bone of St. John, while inside St. Peter's they claimed to have his whole skeleton. In the marketplace they sold real splinters from the cross, and here he watched people spending their last coins just for a chance to see these holy objects. And again, Luther was struck by how empty and materialistic and greedy this circus really was, and how it was taking advantage of people. Luther's mentor had sent him to Rome to inspire him, but instead Luther returned back to Germany more disillusioned than ever before. Following his trip to Rome, Luther moves away from the monastery. He moves to the university town of Wittenberg. Now, Wittenberg was ruled by the local ruler called Frederick the Wise, and Frederick was personally passionate about knowledge and wisdom. He even had a good collection of books himself. But unlike many of the other local rulers, Frederick wanted his town to be one of learning, and he often invited informed speakers and scholars to come and visit and teach at the university. Luther begins teaching at the University of Wittenberg, and in 1512 is made a doctor of theology. In addition to his work at lecturing, he also preached weekly in the Wittenberg church, and his sermons really began gaining a reputation. Sometimes people would come from many towns away just to hear his sermons, because they were so unlike any of the other priests. For one, he actually spoke to the congregation the way a friend down the pub would, in a relatable style. He spoke their language, he asked questions, he even voiced some of the things he himself was struggling with in his faith, something the other Stoic priests and monks would never do. He even translated parts of the Bible in his sermons into the local language, so he would read them in German. People had never heard this been done before, and it sparked a real interest, as well as a real concern by some of the other clergymen. On the other hand, Luther also gained the respect and interest of many of his colleagues at Wittenberg University. Some were shocked or horrified at the questions he'd ask, others were intrigued by how his mind worked. During this time, Luther gained one very close friend in particular, a fellow theologian named Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was not from Germany. He traveled there to study from Switzerland. And Zwingli listened carefully to a lot of the questions Luther was asking about the church and their faith, and it inspired him to go and read and research himself. In his lectures, Luther encouraged his students to ask questions of the established authorities, and he often did so with a humorous spin. He'd say in one of his classes, "Have any of you seen a holy relic?" A few students would raise their hands. "I have too," said Luther. "I've been to Rome and seen the best there are to offer in the world. They have quite a collection. They say 13 out of 12 disciples are buried at St. Peter's, and there's enough nails from the cross to shoe every horse in Europe." Again, this surprising take on the teaching of relics was experienced by some as refreshing and by others as heretical. But outside the classroom jokes and the sermons each Sunday, Luther continued to struggle with God. And while Luther was struggling at his end of the world, the Pope in Rome was getting up to things. He had a brand new idea, another vanity project, to build a glorious new church in Rome, a part of his legacy. And as usual, this meant that it was once more time to send out the money collectors to collect coins for the new project. Spreading out from Rome into all the corners of Europe came hundreds of collectors with what can only be described as a traveling theater. There were fanfares and banners and performers. Each time the company would enter a new town, they would blow their trumpets and gather everyone into the town square. There they would set up a stage where their performers, in bright costumes and masks, would put on a show. And the show usually was the same story, the story of the Judgment Day. Jesus coming in the clouds to judge all the world, the few saints rejoicing while the sinners were tormented, tortured by devils, and thrown into a lake of fire to suffer for eternity. As they watched, the crowd would be caught up in the narrative. After all, this was about their futures, their fates, their only hope. They gasped in horror as those in hell screamed in anguish. The audience whipped into a frenzy of fear, a sense that they would do anything to escape this horrible end. And it would be at this point that the money collectors would take the center stage and announce that there was yet hope, that they could still save themselves and their family members from the fiery pit. And this could be done so through indulgences. We've mentioned indulgences earlier. Let's pause for a moment and have a look at what these actually were. We have said that salvation was taught to work a bit like a point system, that if you had more good than bad points, you were more likely to go to heaven or to spend less time in purgatory when you died. But most people fall short of that, and so you do spend some time in purgatory, a sort of temporary hell, where God would purge the sinner of their remaining sin before being allowed to enter heaven. And of course, the more sin you had to purge, the more years you'd spend there after death. Well, indulgences were part of this point system. They worked as currency. In exchange, buy an indulgence. It came in the form of a letter signed by the Pope, and each document represented a certain amount of time cut off from your time spent in purgatory. So if you bought one indulgence, you might be able to shave off 1 year of torment. And these indulgences were transferable, so you could actually buy it for your loved ones. You could even buy it for a loved one who had already passed away. Imagine your grandmother has passed, and in your grief all you can think about is the pain she must be experiencing presently in purgatory. Of course you'd spend anything you could to shorten her suffering. And this, of course, was why the sales of indulgences was so very, very effective, and why it was such a big business. It played on people's fears of death and their love for their family and friends. The day came when just such a troupe of performers arrived in Luther's town. As usual, they set up their stage and performed in the town square each day, drawing big crowds. And Luther, too, watched, as he'd done many times before, as the actors put on a horrific show to scare people. The money collector, and the one leading this particular troupe, was a man called Johann Tetzel. Now, Tetzel was a German, but notoriously known in Rome as being one of the most effective money collectors which they had at their disposal, because he knew better than anyone how to sway the crowd. He would go into great lengths to put on a show. And during this performance, as Luther is watching, Tetzel steps center stage. He holds his hand over a flaming torch, allowing the fire to burn his hand. The people watch in dismay. He finally pulled his burned hand from the flame and holds it up for all to see, saying, "This is what happens to sinners. Imagine this being your whole body, the agony of it." And then he would hold out the money box, or the coffer, as he called it, and he'd say, "Come, buy an indulgence, help your loved ones and yourself." Tetzel's famous catchphrase was, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Luther was furious at this display. He saw it as a clear abuse of power, and he thought, how can we possibly purchase forgiveness for our sins by giving money to the church? He thought, this can't possibly be the way, but if not this, then what? He felt more confused than ever. He had read the Bible cover to cover, and the Bible had said nothing about purgatory, nor about anyone being able to buy forgiveness. Returning to the university, he continued to search for an answer, and that inward struggle was reaching a boiling point. One evening, Luther was busy in his room reading the Bible, and he ended up deciding he wanted to take a closer look at the book of Romans, a letter written by the Apostle Paul. He was, as usual, searching through those pages for answers to his burning questions. And as he read through the lines, he arrived at Romans chapter 1, verse 17. "For in the gospel it is revealed how God makes people righteous in his sight. From beginning to end it is through trust, just as the scriptures put it. But the person who is righteous will live by trust." And Romans 3:22, "Being made right with God through trust in Jesus Christ for all who believe." Romans 3:24, "We are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." And Romans 5:1, "Therefore, since we have been made right with God through trust, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." Romans 10:9, "Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Luther was shocked, as though he was reading this for the very first time. He turned next to the book of Ephesians. For it is by grace you have been saved, through trust, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Luther had found his answer in Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul wrote, "The righteous shall live by faith." Although he'd read those words before, it finally clicked into place for him, and he saw the reality of it through the fog of church dogma and what he'd been taught his whole life. Being called righteous or declared righteous means being right with God, being right in our relationship with God. So we live and are made right with God by trusting in His grace, His free gift. Many of our Bible translations opt here for the word faith, but trust is a more accurate translation. That evening turned Luther's whole life around. He read through the Bible again and suddenly realized the whole narrative was saying the same thing, and it had either been missed or silenced by those who sought to abuse their power or drive people to God through fear. But now Luther saw the truth of it, the way salvation really works. He could finally see God for who He really is, and Luther got to work. He spent months working on wording this new discovery and how to explain this theology to other people in as clear and an accessible way as possible. On the 31st of October, 504 years ago, Luther took a public stand. He wrote down his thesis, his discovery. He marched over to the Wittenberg's castle church and nailed it to the church door. This would become known as the 95 Thesis, because in this document Luther wrote down 95 points, 95 questions he had for the church, 95 questions he wished to invite others to consider and discuss. In it, he challenged the teachings of the Pope, asking why the Pope is the ultimate spiritual authority and not the Bible. He argued we need to return to the Bible instead. For example, thesis number 82. He asked if the Pope can spring someone from purgatory for the sake of building a cathedral, then why doesn't he empty purgatory out of holy love? Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door is considered the birth of the Western Protestant Reformation. In the coming weeks, Luther goes at teaching and preaching in churches and universities about his discovery. He shares with anyone who will listen that salvation is a free gift given by Jesus alone. He publicly attacks the sales of indulgences and attacks the papal abuses now apparent to him. Now, originally Luther had written his thesis, as the academic he was, in Latin, so that other scholars and theologians were invited to engage with these questions. However, Luther's friends translated his paper into German and printed it for mass consumption. Soon, to all towns in Germany, this thesis was being read by and to people, and news of it spread like wildfire. And in the coming months, sales of indulgences went down dramatically. During this time in Europe, an incredibly important and impactful invention had been made, and this invention was called the printing press. We said how books were rare early in Luther's time. Everything was handwritten and hand-copied, and materials were expensive, and the written word was as rare as literacy was. Hence why the nobility had power over information. But with the printing press coming on the scene, A whole new way of getting information out quickly and cheaply was made available to Luther. He thought, how can I help people understand the Bible and the good news about salvation in Jesus, but also how many people can't even read? And so Luther did two things. Firstly, between 1519 and 1520, he wrote a whole lot. He published a series of pamphlets developing his emerging ideas. They were called On Christian Liberty, On the Freedom of a Christian Man, To the Christian Nobility, and so on. All explaining in short, concise, and sometimes even funny ways how the Pope was abusing his position and the Bible shared a message of hope with people which wasn't what the Church was preaching. The second thing which Luther brilliantly did was use the power of illustrations and comics. Luther was actually quite good at drawing, and he began making these comics that any peasant could understand, even if he couldn't read. And he also invited his friend, who was a professional illustrator, to make comics about the Pope, the Bible, the Church. Both these written pamphlets, as well as illustrations, were spreading throughout Europe. It was helping people ask questions and think for themselves, and even inspiring others to challenge the Church. During this time, Luther also developed a guideline to help express this newfound view of God and faith. It is called the Five Solas. In Latin, they went sola scriptura, scripture alone, sola fide, faith alone, sola gratia, grace alone, solo Christo, Christ alone, soli Deo gloria, to the glory of God alone. Let's have a look at what each of these meant. Sola means in Latin only or alone. Sola number 1, scripture alone. This idea was to emphasize that the Bible alone ought to be the source of authority for Christians. This, in turn, was rejecting the authority of the Pope and of the Christian tradition as being considered equal voices to the Bible. Anything taught by the Pope, clergy, or in the tradition of the Church which negates the Bible ought to be put aside. Number 2, sola fide, faith alone or trust alone. This emphasized that salvation is a free gift given by God to anyone who wants it. This was a critique against the Church's sales of indulgences and said you can't buy salvation or earn it through good works or a point system, but you can trust that God's saving is enough for you. Number 3, sola gratia. This brought to the front the reason for salvation, that it comes from God's grace and who He is, not because of what we do, and this free gift reveals to us the character of God. Number 4, solo Christo. This emphasized the sole role of Jesus in salvation. The Church had placed its priests as intercessors between God and people, where people could confess their sins to the priests and receive forgiveness this way, thus making priests and the Church a necessary tool in the path to God. But Luther was arguing, no, as Hebrews 4, verse 15 teaches, we have a high priest who knows our weakness, who understands our struggle. The interceder and connection between mankind and God is God Himself. Jesus is our high priest. And finally, number 5, soli Deo gloria. This emphasized that rather than striving to please church leaders or investing in the glory of the church, its buildings and institution, the glory belongs to God. It's Him who is moving the narrative forward, taking the initiative and reaching out to help us. These five solas were responses to the current state of the Church at the time of Luther, and they sought to adjust the way people viewed their faith. And again, these words had massive consequences in many communities, and news of them spread everywhere, including all the way back to Rome. Meanwhile, in Rome, the old pope had died and a new one took his place. News about Luther and what he was teaching reached the ears of the new pope, called Leo X, and Leo was furious. He called Luther a heretic and sent him a formal message threatening excommunication if he didn't recant in 60 days. Excommunication meant being banished from the church. Today, this may sound like small fry. Okay, I'm not a part of your club anymore. But in those days, this was the ultimate threat, worse than death. Because remember, the belief was that there is no salvation, no path to God outside the church. It has to go through the church, through the Pope. And so excommunicating someone meant that you are condemning this person both in this life and for eternity, damning them to hell. Luther received Pope Leo's message, and he carried on undeterred. In fact, he begins publishing more messages than ever before. Finally, Luther is charged with the crime of heresy by Rome. He is called to defend himself in the town of Augsburg, where representative bishops from Rome are to examine him. During the examination, Luther defends himself with arguments based on the Bible rather than church doctrine. The bishops are horrified by his boldness. And right after the meeting, Luther has to flee for his life from Augsburg. In those days, Germany wasn't ruled by one king, but there were many regions that would be ruled by local princes. And so Luther returns to the region where Wittenberg lies, because there he is under the protection of Frederick the Wise, a ruler who has become quite fond of Luther and who has no interest in handing him over to the army of Rome. Well, in 1520, the Pope responds by publicly burning all of Luther's writings and forbidding them from being read. And Luther, in reply, publicly burns the Pope's letter to him, showing all watching that he's not afraid of the Pope and doesn't consider him to have an authority over his soul. Rome then hires its own illustrators. They mass-produce comics depicting Luther, saying he's being taught by the devil what to say. In response, Luther publicly declares that the Pope is the Antichrist. Now, Antichrist is a loaded word that has been flung around a lot, so let's make sure we understand what it means. Antichrist is a term used in the Bible to describe individuals or powers which would, 1, claim to have the authority which only Jesus has, or 2, work to interfere or get in the way of what Jesus is doing. So, for example, Jesus in his time had a very fierce critique to give to the religious leaders of his day. Jesus said, "I am the door, and what I open, no man can shut." In other words, if I open a door for humanity to access God and life and forgiveness, no one else gets to close that door, or even to guard that door or to police it. He described the Pharisees as barring the door for others to enter the kingdom, and then refusing themselves to enter in. Here Luther was describing the post as an antichrist power, something which is anti-Jesus, because the Pope, like the Pharisees, were attempting to block or to police a door which no man has authority over except God. And by claiming to have the right to decide who gets to be in the church, who gets to be in God's kingdom or not, was distinctly Antichrist. Well, this back and forth goes on for a while, but a war of words soon turns into a war of action. In January of 1521, Pope Leo X excommunicates Luther. He is commanded to stand trial in a German town called Worms, where a council of high bishops, clergymen, and other Roman officials will examine him and then come to a verdict on what is to be his fate. Specifically, the purpose of the trial is also to examine Luther's 95 Theses and to get him to recant, which means to take them back, to disown or to denounce what he said. At this point, most of the local princes of the regions of Germany are too afraid to defend or protect Luther from Rome's judgment. They don't dare to go up against the Pope out of fear that they too may be excommunicated, or that they may be on the receiving end of his army. And so Luther is brought to Worms to stand trial. When people around the country hear this is happening, they flood to the courthouse in Worms to hear the trial. It is said so many listeners tried to cram into the upper balcony of the hall that it creaked and nearly collapsed. At the hearing is Emperor Charles V, other princes and noblemen, clergymen, bishops, and officials from Rome. Luther is brought from his prison cell, and before going into the courtroom, his old mentor Staupitz comes to see him. Staupitz says, "You've done a great job pointing out the corruption among the clergy of the church, but you've taken things too far to go up against the church itself and say that people can find salvation outside it. This is too much." Luther replied, "That day when you sent me out so boldly to change the world, did you really think there wouldn't be a cost?" Inside the crowded courtroom, Luther takes a stand and hears the accusations against him. Lines from his thesis and other writings are produced as evidence and read aloud, and at the end, he is asked in front of everyone, "Will you recant? Will you withdraw these statements?" At this point, Luther knows what has happened to hundreds of others who have gone up against the Pope and the Church. Nonetheless, he replies, "I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." And so the overseers find Luther guilty of heresy, and he leaves the courtroom as a public outlaw at the mercy of Rome. As he is being brought out of the courthouse and presumably going to either be taken to prison to await a sentence there or taken to Rome to be executed, Luther is kidnapped by men on horses. With a cowl over his head, he is taken from the courthouse. After some riding, the men who have taken Luther stop and remove the cowl, and to his great surprise, he discovers that they are soldiers of Frederick the Wise. Frederick had had a feeling that things would go wrong at the Council of Worms, and so he had arranged for his men to seemingly kidnap Luther before Rome's soldiers could get their hands on him. They take Luther into hiding at Wartburg Castle, and he is kept there in secret under the protection of Frederick the Wise. Luther spends weeks alone in the tower of the castle. His beard grows long, he goes under the alias name Squire George, and with all this time on his hands, Luther does something. In just 10 weeks, Luther translates the New Testament from Greek into German. He gives this, the first New Testament in German, to Frederick the Wise as a gift. In the coming months, this translation is published for mass distribution. Imagine being able to read those words in one's own language for the first time. To hear the words of Jesus in your own language. Luther had presently slipped through the fingers of the Pope, but for now Leo was distracted by other matters, as local wars were breaking out in other parts of Europe, and he had to go deal with them. This meant that the focus and heat around Luther died down for a bit, and he could once more return to Wittenberg in 1522. That year, on December the 25th, Christmas Day, Luther holds for the townspeople the first church service and Mass in Germany that's not in Latin, but in the German language entirely. And in the coming months, it is truly a beautiful time in Wittenberg and beyond, as Luther and those helping him begin to set in place more social reforms. For one, he allows those who have died from suicide to be buried in the church graveyard, instead of in an unmarked grave as the church demanded. He said that becoming overwhelmed by pain in this world doesn't condemn a person or banish them from God. Secondly, he begins opening the university and classes for women, a thing which was next to unheard of. He argued that women are the same as men and should be given access to learning how to read, to reading the Bible, and to all the same education as their male counterparts. Because of Luther's work, the Bible is now becoming more accessible throughout Europe, as others follow his example, and it is translated into English and French as well as German. Thirdly, Luther began encouraging musicians to write the truths they are discovering into songs and hymns. Luther himself, in addition to being an excellent artist, is also musically gifted, and he writes many hymns and songs which can be sung by his congregation. In fact, Luther wanted to make, as in the case of the illustrations, healthy theology and biblical truths accessible to anyone. And so he borrowed the melody of well-known songs people used to sing in pubs and brothels, and he simply changed the words. A song he did this with is a hymn which is well known today, A Mighty Fortress. So people down the pub would know the melody already and could easily sing it. Luther also encourages monks and nuns to leave their monasteries, saying, "Don't live behind closed doors, away from the world, punishing yourselves and then thinking you're doing something good. Instead, go out and love people, be part of your communities and serve them." Many monks and nuns respond positively to this encouragement, and one of the nuns who left her nunnery behind was a woman called Katharina von Bora. She, along with a few other nuns, managed to escape from their nunnery, and they come to Luther's university, where they are given a place to stay and a chance to start a new life. And in those days, Zwingli, Luther's close confidant and friend, says, "I'm going home to Switzerland to teach these things to my own people." Zwingli returned home and spent the next years working towards one goal, which was to make a Bible available to every household in Switzerland. In 1525, Luther marries Katharina von Bora, and they end up having 6 children. And in the next few years, Luther continues to write more books, speak publicly, and encourage others to learn about God and the Bible themselves. And finally, after years of work, Luther finishes translating the entire Bible, including the Old Testament, into German. Things were still risky for him. He never knew when the wars in Europe might die down, and the Pope might again turn his focus on him and hunt him down. And of course, there were limits to how much Frederick the Wise could protect him alone. But then, to Luther's surprise, in 1537 he receives an invitation. And this invitation is from none other than the princes, lords, and rulers of the other regions of Germany. The letter says that they are interested in hearing what Luther has to say, and they invite him to come present his thesis and beliefs. And of course, it's crossed Luther's mind at this point that this could be a trap, set by the church to lure him outside the area of Frederick's domain and capture him there. But Luther concludes in the end, there is too great an opportunity here to miss out. Here are all the rulers and highest authorities in Germany, and they want to hear the good news about a good God. So Luther goes, and lo and behold, it turns out not to be a trap. All those princes and emperors who were so afraid of standing up to the Pope are now desperate to hear the word of God and hear Luther present what he's discovered. And he does. Everyone in the room listens until he's done, and they are each of them so overwhelmed by the beauty of this narrative and the truth of a gracious God that they decide to no longer be subject to Rome or to the Pope. And in the coming years, although many of them have to fight wars against the papal army, they stand firm in their convictions and continue to resist. So, we have now heard the story of Martin Luther's life and the Reformation which grew out of his and other people's seeking. What do we do with this story? And what does this religious reform, long ago in the Middle Ages, have to do with us today? First of all, we might ask, what is the legacy of the Reformation? Many have come away thinking the legacy of the Reformation was just the church was split into two parts, so two denominations, Catholic and Protestant. But this is a rather weak understanding of what happened. Luther didn't set out to create a denomination or a new church. He wasn't advocating denominations, which at his time is a word that didn't even exist. Protestant comes from the word protest. Imagine how incredibly brave Luther chose to be. In his mind, in his world, there was only one church. It's not like today where if you don't like the doctrine of your denomination, you can just go down the road to another church. No, a huge legacy of the Reformation was exemplifying the freedom and importance of questioning the authority of organized religion. And secondly, the importance of continuing to keep asking and keep seeking. When I was in high school, there were those in my class who were obsessed with Coldplay. The band had just released a new album called Viva la Vida, and the chorus of the title song went, "I hear Jerusalem bells are ringing, Roman cavalry choirs are singing." And upon hearing classmates singing this chorus, some of the more conservative members of the class gasped and went, "Are you singing about Roman Catholic choirs? You can't do that." Now, for one, the line went Roman cavalry, not Roman Catholic, as they misheard. And for the second, so what if the line went Roman Catholic choirs are singing? Is uttering those words going to bring down a curse on us? You may have, similarly to myself, grown up around a Christian denomination which, in many ways, demonizes the current Roman Catholic Church. Now, if that's what you take away from this story, the story of the Reformation, then you haven't taken away much. The point of this part of history isn't to say that Catholics are the boogeymen. And if you come away from this thinking that Catholics are vampires walking the earth, then you've missed the point. The Reformation is a double-edged sword with great hope and a serious warning to us all. The hope is that God is kind, not a torturing, harsh, demanding judge who threatens us with hell. The warning is exemplified by the people whom Jesus called standing in the way of a door he's opened, and how very, very easily anyone may come to view themselves as having a right to police the truth, or who gets to have access to Jesus and the church and his kingdom. For example, we must ask ourselves, are we today policing, through our hard or soft power, who gets to have access to God, who gets to be forgiven, who gets to be in the church or in God's kingdom? Do we police the door which no man can shut? For example, today in a denomination called the Seventh-day Adventist Church, when people are baptized, they are baptized into the church. And if that membership is removed or annulled, their baptism is annulled as well, thus putting a membership to a religious organization on the same level as baptism in Jesus, the symbolic act of stating, I believe that Jesus died and rose again, and that I have part in his resurrection. Something to think about. In conclusion, I'd like us to consider the following. Number 1, how easy it is for Protestants today to become as the Catholic Church was in the Middle Ages. Number 2, how easy it is for us as individuals and as a group or institution to become anti-Christ, to take on authority which doesn't belong to us. Number 3, how important it is to keep practicing sound, responsible theology, and that is an ongoing journey. The method we use matters a lot. Number 4, how important it is for theological tools to be made available to anyone, not just pastors or theologians, but to be accessible in order to empower Christians everywhere. Number 5, how important it is to continuously seek and think. Number 6, to consider that theology isn't just a lofty practice in theory. When our view of God shifts, so does our view of the world and of ourselves. This impacts every aspect of life. By empowering people to question religion, the Reformers enabled people to challenge many other harmful systems in their society. This had ramifications in the sector of education, technology, sex, medicine. Europe had been in what is called the Dark Ages. Following Jesus gave the general public the power to move out of the Dark Age into new things. Number 7, we ought to remember that outward stability, seeming unity, and order isn't the greatest good, and ought not to be achieved at any cost, because unity is not uniformity. And lastly, we should consider that we today do not have a perfect theology. Nobody does. Theology means knowledge of God. How can any of us have a perfect knowledge of a perfect being? We do not sit with a perfect vision of everything, and that calls for a continuous willingness to learn, to listen, to consider, and where relevant, to incorporate new light as God leads us, and being willing to move and follow where he leads. That was the Reformation story, centered around the life of Martin Luther. To conclude our evening together today, we're going to sing some songs that touch on some of the topics which we've been exploring. Let us sing together, and beyond that, I wish you all a good night and happy Reformation Day.
punishment's a poor incentive to trust another with your life and heart. And I am drawn to you just like a whisper, the power of a voice that needn't shout. It is your kindness that leads me to repentance. Your loving patience makes room. When my eyes are open to see the one called Jesus, it's when my heart is stirred in me to move towards you. Tried to share you through their methods, wielding fear like weapons set to cut. But Jesus' kingdom doesn't spread through hatred or separating everyone from us. And I am drawn to you just like a fire, spilling warmth and passion from your heart. It is your kindness that leads me to repentance. Your loving patience makes room. When my eyes are open to see the one called Jesus, it's when my heart is stirred in me to move towards you. Fought to the death, and those who would be followers of Jesus must follow in his steps. Kindness leads us to repentance, and it's your patience that makes when our heart is stirred in us to move. It's when my heart is stirred in me to move towards you. It is not a test of science or an encyclopedia, nor is it a mere collection of abstract moral thought. It's the real us for hypocrisy, the gap between our words and lives. Oh Father, you the truth itself, come and cast your light upon our lives. Forgive us for our apathy when faced with others' burdens. Create a servant's heart in me. Follow Jesus into service. Forgive us for our arrogance when we hide behind traditions. Come wash our false entitlement with a spirit of humility. Forgive us for unwillingness, for the times we don't respond to you. Oh, thank you for your patient love, where we always find forgiveness. No liturgy can conjure up your presence. No words can bind your will to any man. We can't control your favor with tradition. No ritual could ever force your hand. But you come close, because you're good. You come close, because you're good. You can't be bought with any of our offerings, manipulated into our hands. You can't afford to pay the steep admission. No mortal soul can foil your gifts so blessed. But you persist, because you're kind. You persist, because you're kind. So come relinquish efforts that are futile. Come rest into